Okay, so today on Staying Fertile AF, we're going to do something a little bit different. I actually came across this X post by Johan Kurtz. I don't really know him, but reading through his post, I really liked his take on increasing birth rates and how that relates with status. All right, let's get into it. First off, this is Johan Kurtz, and this is where his post starts. So, South Korea spent $200 billion trying to increase its birth rates. Hungary spends 5% of GDP. Both are failing. $200 billion and 5% of GDP, that's a hell of a lot of money, and it's not working. So, that's a bit disappointing. Clearly, something's wrong. Yet, the small country of Georgia spiked its birth rates massively without spending a dollar. How? They understood that fertility isn't about money, it's about status. Interesting. Some of the things I've thought could benefit birth rates would be like government incentives, providing money for families, but maybe money isn't the only reason people have kids. Okay, let's continue. Before explaining the importance of status, let's quickly note that the common explanation of why fertility is collapsing cannot be the whole story. As the above countries and the Nordics show, giving people economic benefits to have children doesn't move the needle. So he was saying South Korea and Hungary, and then the Nordic countries, which I've also talked about in some of my videos before, where the government gives families money per child to support them. But even then, it's showing here that the OECD countries, that despite getting money for having kids, it's not pushing the birth rates higher, it's not increasing them. So this is evidence that not only money will help, obviously. You don't decide to have kids just for money reasons. Religiosity alone does not have the answers. So he's looking at religion as well here. Even if you isolate the most religious population, weekly church attenders, within the most religious of major Western countries, the USA, you find barely break-even fertility rates. We'll look at the Amish and Jews shortly. So despite being more religious, it doesn't really correlate with having more children, even though some people might assume that. We can see here that religious people are slightly above the rate of replacement for fertility, but it's not enough. So despite being religious, it has a bit of an effect, but it's not enough, is what Johan Kurtz here is saying. The last decade has seen a substantial increase in the share of millennials who own homes. By 2022, more than 50% of US millennials were homeowners, but childlessness in the same cohort has continued apace. So he was first talking about the religious reasons that doesn't push people to have more kids. Now he goes and looks at homeowners, and even though homeownership has increased, which could be thought as a correlation to have more kids, despite this, it's not pushing people to have more children. The collapse in fertility rates in the Western world, which started over a century ago, long precedes the advent of oral contraceptive pills, as well as endocrine disruptors and other relevant chemical agents which might be interfering with fertility health. So this figure shows here a total fertility rate in the United Kingdom from 1800 to 2020. Here he's asking, is it contraception? Is it contraceptive pills that's causing people to have fewer kids? But he argues again that that's not the case because the collapse in fertility started over a century ago. So we've been having fewer and fewer kids long before contraceptions were introduced into our society. And it clearly shows that there is something else behind this crisis right now of people having fewer children. Okay, he continues here. We are thus presented with an apparent paradox, a stable trend which continues to unfold across the West, in country after country, generation after generation, without an obvious causal logic. How is this to be explained? So he's saying that we can't really explain, or at least we can't say with any statistical reasons, why we're having fewer children in the West. I propose that there is in fact an underappreciated fundamental cause of these trends, which manifests in the form of different proximate causes, real and imagined, across different geographies and times. This fundamental cause is status. The usual reasons for people not to have kids that we hear about, like economic hardship or work-life balance, are just surface level symptoms across, the West or the globe. And these aren't the actual reasons why we have declining birth rates. But he's kind of saying that it's actually because of status. Social status denotes a universal set of human instincts and behaviors. Status describes the perceived standing of the individual within the group. It denotes their social value and their place within the formal and informal hierarchies, which comprises a society. So Johan's saying here that status is more than just a social standing. It's embedded in our instincts and our behaviors. It's an interesting way to look at status like the core motivator affecting decisions like having kids, not just as a superficial social label. It finds expression in the behavior of defense, access, inclusion, approval, acclaim, respect, and honor, and indeed in their opposites, rejection, ostracization, humiliation, and so forth. So the real driver, according to him, is how people perceive their status in society when deciding to have kids. It's a really interesting perspective, actually, because it flips the usual narrative. Kids have kind of stopped being a status symbol. It's kind of now what you do that defines how much you matter or your status. Being a parent or having kids isn't really a status symbol anymore. So kids kind of prevent us from getting status because kids prevent us from working more hours, and working more hours will give us a higher position, aka a higher status. So very interesting points here. Status is gained and maintained through approved behaviors, achievement, etiquette, defending the group, and through the possession of recognized status symbols, titles, wealth, important physical assets. So this point is pretty clear. Status isn't just about who you are, but it's about what you do and what you have. It's earned by behaving in ways that society values and by owning symbols that signal success like titles and wealth. So he's really saying that status isn't just something you have. It's something you earn and you gain through your actions and your possessions. So it's actually not a fixed label. It's kind of like a dynamic, constantly changing thing. My belief, our post-enlightenment values result in the net status outcome of having a child being lower than the status outcome of various competing undertakings. And this is incredibly important. I'll break this down in more detail. This is kind of what I was mentioned earlier. Johan actually believes that having children today actually lowers your status compared to other pursuits like climbing the career ladder or focusing on getting a higher education. And I think he's pointing out here that it's a key indicator for the low birth rates that we have today. As an explanatory factor, status has the advantage of being a relative as opposed to absolute attribute. This is important because absolute material conditions have radically improved while birth rates have fallen. Many children used to die young. So what he's saying here is that status matters more because it's relative and not absolute. So even though our living conditions have improved and child mortality has dropped, we're still having fewer children. It's not just about having better living standards. It's how people perceive their standing in society compared to others. Status is also of existential importance to individuals. This is necessary for our inquiry. We are seeking a behavioral determinant which is powerful enough to influence fundamental human decisions like whether or not to reproduce. People kill themselves over loss of status. Yeesh, yikes. Here he's really underlining how deeply status influences our human behavior. It's so powerful that it can really drive life-changing choices like having children, or if you take it to the other extreme, it can lead to other actions like suicide over the loss of status. I think what he's arguing here is that status is extremely crucial because it impacts our very existence. Where is the evidence of my theory? Let us turn to the first of the small number of European Asian countries which defy wider fertility trends. This is the country Georgia, which sits at the intersection of two continents with a population of about 4 million. I guess we're going to look here at how Georgia actually has better fertility rates compared to most countries. In the mid-2000s, Georgia spiked its birth rates, which went from 50,000 to 64,000 over the course of 2 years, a 28% increase, which it sustained for many years. How? So it looks like births to married women spike, unmarried births, yeah, not as high, but okay. So the evidence points to an unusual factor. A prominent patriarch of the popular Georgian Orthodox Church, Ilya II, announced that he would personally baptize and become godfather to all their children onwards. That's that's kind of funny, and that's pretty cool. So that means that if you have 3 kids, the third child would be the godchild to this Ilya II. That's kind of fun. Births of third children boomed, so much so in fact that it eclipsed continuing declines in first and second children. This has widely been understood as a religious phenomenon, but I propose that it is better understood as a status phenomenon. What he's saying here is that despite the decline of people who had 1 or 2 kids, so fewer people were having 1 or 2 kids, people who had 3 children spiked so much that it's kind of like saving the birth rates of Georgia. I think that's kind of a genius incentive. Like it brings in or shows parents that, culturally they are being supported to have children because they are being recognized and celebrated. So I think that's wonderful. Whether you agree religious reasons or not should be a part of this. It's just showing that like somebody people in the society care about also cares about them. So it's kind of like a good exchange here. What about the inverse? Can status suppress birth rates? It can. Let's turn to the canonical example of low fertility, South Korea. South Korea is meant to have the lowest birth rates in the world. I think in 2023, it was said they were on 0.72 kids per woman. So that's way below the rate of replacement. And I also saw another article that by 2100, the Korean population will have halved. So that's not sustainable at all. Let's see why this is. Thanks to the Korean formalized system of etiquette, language, and titles, social hierarchies are clear, explicit, and prominent. So the culture in Korea, they have super formal hierarchies, very clear etiquette and social standings. Individuals are incentivized to take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that their rank within the system is maximized. So people are pushed to constantly strive for higher status. Ranking as high as possible in their society is the main goal. This process finds particular expression within the structure of the Korean economy, in which the only high-status employers are the small number of industrial mega conglomerates like Samsung, the so-called chaebols. A quote from Malcolm Simon H. Collins, who worked there. Understand how much the chaebol system matter in Korea. You are not a person of equal status to other people if you don't work at one of the chaebols. The chaebols are extremely important to your social status within Korea. Your life is spent to try to get that perfect test score so you can get into the perfect chaebol. That's super interesting. So I guess if you don't work for Samsung or Hyundai, you're not seen as anyone with very high status. That's kind of what you're striving to do. I don't think in other countries it's as important as in South Korea about the company you work for, but I do think it does affect people to some degree. I think if you're a consultant at McKinsey, or even right now Nvidia kind of gives you some clout, people do kind of see you as a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit I think your status would elevate a little bit if you work for these places, but I don't think it's as pronounced as South Korea. But I think we all internally have a psychological need for status. So competition is fierce and hinges on each individual's performance in the national exam, which determines university places. This exam is so important that they ground all planes and clear traffic on the one day each year it occurs. That's insane. That's so crazy. Oh my God. Not only do they stop planes and clear traffic to make sure that people can concentrate, I guess, on these exams, but there's only one number that's going to define your status symbol in Korea. That's wild. All right. Each child must receive exceptional training to perform at this exam. This means parents must pay for extended, expensive tutoring, and this in turn precludes almost all couples from having large families. I mean, of course, it's must be so expensive because if that one test determines your status in society for the rest of your life and every child has a tutor, that obviously becomes very expensive. I provide more examples of status being the clear determinant factor in most notable fertility trends on my blog. The thread is already too long, so go there if you want more evidence. For now, let's understand the specific mechanisms at play. A useful model we can take from the literature is to classify the source of status into three types: dominance, virtue, and success. There's three types of status to categorize or break down someone's social standing. Bill Storr describes, in dominance games, status is coerced by force or fear. In virtue games, status is awarded to players who are conspicuously dutiful, obedient, and moralistic. In success games, status is awarded for the achievement of closely specified outcomes beyond simply winning that require skill, talent, or knowledge. In the pre-Enlightenment period, a woman's status was defined by her birth class, maintained by her virtue, virginity, piety, motherhood, and modified substantially by her husband's status. Okay, so he's just mentioning that back in the Enlightenment period, women's status mainly came from her class and was maintained by her virtue, and then it was heavily shaped depending on her husband's status. The primary source of her status was therefore upheld by the church, which held a role of social dominance incomparable to today, and her family, embedded within a formalized class structure. So he's pointing out here that women's status back then mainly came from the church, which used to have a very big influence, and also her family, which was, tied to the strict class system that there used to be in the day. In other words, the pre-Enlightenment woman derived her status from virtue and dominance. These virtue strategies did not trade off with fertility, and likely supported it, with the church's teaching of conjugal duty and family demanding heirs. A woman's status in the pre-Enlightenment time came from virtue and dominance, so the church and then maintained by virtue. These strategies didn't conflict with having children back in the day. They probably actually encouraged it. The church was promoting the woman to do her duties and creating heirs for the family. The Enlightenment brought with it not just intellectual, economic, and scientific revolutions, it drove a status revolution. It challenged the dominance of the church and the aristocracy through the elevation of the ideals of equality, free thinking, and meritocracy. So it seems like this time period really shook some things up, and not just intellectually or scientifically, but it redefined status itself. The church and the aristocratic institutions were challenged to promote equality and merit instead. And this kind of stands today. Like, this is kind of how we maintain our status in our society. In turn, this emphasizes on the moral primacy of meritocracy, changed the primary status game for dominance and virtue to success, with those who demonstrated exceptional knowledge or professional skills held in newly high esteem. Here we're shifting the status game from dominance and virtue, now switching it to success, rewarding individual achievement like knowledge and skills. Importantly, meritocracy is an individualist model of status. The status secured by a prominent scientist does not necessarily extend to his wife or children. It's an interesting point on how modern status is more about personal success instead of like a shared social standing. So let's continue. The successful accrual of status through virtue mechanisms requires one to be embedded in a largely static community with shared norms who appreciate and reward sacrifices made for the group. So he's saying here that status through virtue works best in like tight-knitted communities that value like group sacrifices. Conversely, status makers associated with success, wealth, knowledge, skill attach primarily to the individual and the fungible across groups and geographies, thereby retaining value in less dense networks. This becomes important in an era of mass transportation. So he's saying that in today's world where people move around a lot, status is linked to individual success, so like wealth or skills. This matters more because it holds value all over the world, because everyone can understand that, you know, somebody who works at McKinsey as a consultant, or at least in the Western world, like that holds more merits perhaps. And that makes sense because our world is super connected and mobile. Thus, the Enlightenment initially opened up new status opportunities for men, success, whilst undermining those that supported women, virtue. So he's saying here that the Enlightenment period created new ways for men to gain status through success, but it took away the traditional paths for women, which was virtue. We all have a psychological need for status, and so it was only a matter of time before women demanded access to and participation within success games, education, commerce, politics, and even sports. It's no surprise that women pushed to join the new success games to make sure that they were equal in work, in education, within politics, because everyone wants status. Unfortunately, acquiring status through success games is time intensive, and unlike virtue games, trade-offs directly with fertility. Interesting. So the problem is success takes time, and that often competes with having children. Over time, this set of status mechanics spread, intensified, and deepened, particularly during the process of urbanization during the Industrial Revolution. Ultimately, this culminated in today, when the standard introductory question has become, what do you do? Right now, we're in a place where people ask, what do you do? Instead of thinking about family or community. So this post is really interesting because it really makes you think about how the need for status can really affect birth rates. This is because the most effective way to gauge the status of one's interlocutor is to understand their level of success within our meritocracy. So the quickest way to judge someone's status is to judge how successful they are. It's all about what the person has achieved. Unfortunately, I'm a mother is not a good answer to this question because this conveys little status within a success framework, which is usually the operative one. So is there any hope for future generations? Yes. So here's pointing out that saying I'm a mother doesn't carry much weight in our success-driven society, where status is tied to individual achievement. But here I'd argue that being a mother might not be highly valued, but never being a mother might make people question why. Childless men aren't typically judged negatively, but childless women often are. Even if it doesn't elevate your status in the beginning, I think there's still an expectation on having children that shapes how people see them. Okay. The Amish and the Orthodox Jews have very high birth rates despite living in Western countries. Okay, so this once again shows that religious groups or religious communities tend to have higher kids. I propose that the fundamental driver of their birth rate is not merely their religiousness. It is their isolation and in-group preference, which has allowed for the preservation of virtue games. Okay, so he's saying it's not religious reasons that's pushing the birth rates or increasing the birth rates within these communities. It's actually because they are so tight-knit and have strong group ties, similar to the virtue-based games, which keeps traditional values alive. Through the cultivation of intense social density and homogeneity, they have built what I call a mimemic infrastructure, which enforces people full participation in the religious duties if they are to maintain standing in the group. So he's kind of saying that like social pressures make people stick to their religious roles to keep and maintain their status in their group. So it's an interesting take on how tight-knit communities and groups can actually maintain or ensure certain behaviors from people. Western governments should pursue policies which give greater space for the rise of other stable groupings of people with sub-identities within which alternative status ecosystems can flourish. As a first step, governments must do everything they can to foster the creation of future mimemic infrastructures which support virtue games. These cultural colonies must be uninterrupted to the greatest degree possible by the state imposed of universal enlightenment success games. So I think what Johan's suggesting here is that Western governments should create a space for like virtue-based communities that can thrive without interference. So essentially encourage close-knit groups that value having children, because then that could potentially increase birth rates because the ones within the group status will increase. What do you guys think? Do you agree with this idea, or do you have any other solutions that could boost birth rates? Please share your opinions and ideas in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching my video today, and remember to stay fertile AF.